Welcome back. Hopefully you have an okay understanding of the rules of how Yahtzee should work, what our implementation should do, because the whole exercise is that I'm giving you a application that is almost done, but there's some bugs, there's some logic that's missing, some styling that's missing. So if you don't understand the game, it's going to be a little tricky to make it work. So this project, I give you a pretty substantial application, at least relative to what we've been doing. And there's multiple parts, multiple things I'm asking you to do. Usually I would just run through all of them at the beginning in this video and then say, hey, I'll have a solution coming up after this. However, some of these parts actually rely on earlier parts, meaning like there's a bug that won't be apparent until you fix an earlier bug. So it will be hard for me to demonstrate that unless we fix that first bug. So rather than just going through all of the problems at once, I'm going to go through one at a time in each video. So in this video, we're focusing on part one, which is really just about understanding the flow, the state, the methods, how everything fits together, the structure of the components in the application. So we're not actually making anything or fixing anything. And I really recommend you do this part on your own. It's very important to understand how this app works. And honestly, me explaining it is nowhere near as valuable as you figuring it out or trying to figure it out and having questions and then watching the video. So diagram all the components, figure out what's in the state at what point. I would just run the app, open up the React Dev tools, peek around, look at the state, try clicking things, see what happens. And then after that, the next video will focus on part two, and then we'll have a solution. Part three will be the next video. So I'm going to do one video per section here. All right, so let's begin with understanding the flow of the application. You need to download the starter code, npm install, npm start, and you should see something like this. It's pretty similar to the final version. The icons are different. There's not a total score at the bottom, and there are some bugs. So I can roll. And the biggest bug that we're going to fix in the next video, the most obvious one, is that I cannot freeze any dice. So if I try and click on something, we get a big error. So we'll be fixing that in the next video. But for now, the rest of the game logic works. So I can take these, as long as I'm not freezing dice, I can score. So here I've got 3 2s. So I can do a 3 of a kind, and that works, and that's a proper score. It's just that I can't freeze and keep rolling. So here's what we get when we open up the starter code. We have our super simple app.js. It renders a game component. Now the game component is the most complicated part of the entire game, and that's because it is the only stateful component, at least right now. And if you look at it, it's not that long, but there's quite a few methods and there's a lot of stuff going on in the state. So we have this game component, and let's just take a peek at the render. This is the best way to start to understand the structure of your app. So inside of the game component, we're rendering a dice component and then a score table. So let's go to the React Dev tools over here. Here we go. So we have our app. Inside the app, there's a game component. And if we look at the state for the game, there's an array of numbers called dice. And at the beginning, before we roll, they're all set to null. The app's not quite responsive, but if I click the button, we now have new random dice rolls. 3, 1, 3, 5, 1. So these are the numbers in the dice array. Then we have an array called locked. And right now, everything is set to false, 1 per die. And the way that it works is that as we click to lock one of those dice, then this should switch to true, corresponding to that actual die. But right now, we've seen that that functionality is broken. We're getting an error when we click on the dice. And then there's a piece in the state called rolls left. So that's how many rolls. If I click again, it goes down to 1. And then we've got scores, which right now is an empty object. This is where we'll actually keep track of all of the scoring information. So if I move this over a bit, let's see. There's not much that we can score here. Let's try one more roll. Okay, so we have 2 6s. If I score 6s as 12, that's the score I got. If we come back here, scores now reflects that. 6s is set to 12. So then inside the game component, there's a bunch of markup, but there is a dice component. Let's focus there first. And the dice component just renders 6 die components. So it's just a parent for these 6 die components, and each die component is pretty simple. It's just a button and it displays a number, and it has no state. There is a method handle click. That's the one we're going to fix in the next video that's broken. When we click the die, it should be calling a method to toggle this here to make it locked or unlocked. So I have a little diagram over here. It's not perfect. It's not very pretty, but it shows you the different components. Right now we're focusing on the right side. So there's also the app component, which I didn't bother drawing, but it would be up here. Then we have our game component, and in the state for game, these are the three most important pieces. Dice, which just reflects the actual numbers that should be showing up at any point in the die components. Locked, which I just abbreviated F instead of false, but it's Boolean values, true and false, that reflects which dice are actually locked in, which ones should be rolling, which ones should stay the same. And then scores, I also abbreviated, but it eventually will hold all of the information about the score for your game. How many points did you get for your 4 of a kind and for your full house, etc. Then we have methods. There are 2 main methods that we're going to talk about, and the first one is called toggle locked. So toggle locked is passed down to dice, and from dice, it's passed down again to each die. And then that die will call it when we click on a die, and it's a method that's defined up in the game component. It updates the state. We've seen this pattern before, but rarely, or really not ever so far, where we pass it down more than one level deep. So a stateful parent to a stateless child to another stateless child, and then we call it, and it updates the state in the parent in the game component. So if we look at the code, we can see that here, the method defined inside of game is called toggle locked. It takes an index like 0 or 3, and it should flip the index of the locked array from true to false or false to true. So we're updating the state in the game. And if we look at where it's actually passed down, it's right here to the dice component under the prop name of handle click. And then we look at the dice component. We're not actually calling handle click in here. We're passing it down again to each die. Then in each die component right here, we're finally using it as the callback for on click. So this .props.handle click came from the dice component, handle click, which itself is this .props.handle click coming from the game component, which is a reference right here to toggle locked. So we're passing something down 2 layers deep. The next thing to talk about is the score table component. So the score table is all of this stuff here that we see. So the tables upper and lower that display the scoring, but it's not just about displaying stuff. We also click to assign a score. So perfect, full house. However, the full house side of things is actually broken. That's one of the projects or one of the parts of the exercise is to fix that rule. So let's try again. Okay, well, this is a very weak game, but I'm going to just score ones because I have 2 ones. That's fine. So I get 2 points. So there's some logic here. When we click on this score table or whatever we're clicking on, which actually isn't a score table, it's another component, which is updating the state in the parent of that, which we talked about the scores part of the game component. So score table, we have a method called this.doScore that we're passing down. And this.doScore is right here. We'll talk more about how the rules work, how the score evaluation works later on. But there's this file over here called rules.js, and it has a bunch of rules for things like 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, small straight, large straight. You can see 2 of them have yet to be completed. That's part of your project or your assignment. Yahtzee, a chance. These are all the different rules, and they're actually classes. So we'll go over how they work. But notice at the bottom, we export all of these rules. And then inside of our game.js, we have this method doScore, and it takes a rule name and a rule function. And it will call a rule function and pass in the current values of the dice. And that rule function should return, okay, if this is supposed to be a full house, well, this actually isn't a full house. This is like, there aren't 3 of one and 2 of another, so you score 0. But it will also return a valid score if you do have a full house. And the same applies for all of the other rules. So where this is actually called from is not in the score table. We pass it down to the score table in a prop called doScore, but then in the score table, we're passing it down again to another component called rule row. So a table consists of all of these rows, and our score table consists of a bunch of rule rows. It's annoying to say that word, rule row. And here we're passing down to the rule row a prop called doScore, which is this method that was passed down from the parent, the game component. And we're binding it here and passing in a name and then the actual rule to evaluate. So this is where I recommend you step through this and try and figure out where is this coming from. What is 3 of a kind eval roll, 4 of a kind eval roll? We'll talk about it when we get to the rules part of things in just 2 videos from now, I believe. But it's more beneficial, honestly, for you if you go through it and try and understand it. So each rule row has its own version of do score, which was coming from the game. And then the game passed it to score table passed it down as a prop to rule row. And then in the rule row, we have an on-click that finally calls do score. So the flow for that one looks more like this. In our game component, we have this state where we have scores, and at the beginning it's totally empty. It's just an object. And then we have a method called do scores, and we pass that down to the score table. The score table component in turn passes down a version to rule row. And when we click on that rule row, it is going to call do scores up from in the parent in game, so the parent's parent, and it actually updates the scores piece of the state. Just like we had the same pattern over here, we're going 2 levels deep. You click on rule row, and it's calling a method up in the game component, updating scores, and decides, okay, well, if you're trying to get a full house, you have a full house, you get 30 points. You tried to get a full house, but you actually just have, 4 of a kind, you don't have a full house, then you get 0 points. And then it updates the scores, which causes a re-render. Anyway, so that's the basic component hierarchy. One of the other things we haven't chatted about is actually clicking on that button and getting the dice to roll. So if we look in the game component, this part's actually pretty simple. There's a method called roll right here. And what it does is it basically takes random numbers, generates them only for the dice that actually are unlocked. So, if they're all locked, it's not going to generate any random numbers. If you have 2 dice locked, then it will generate 3 random numbers and update the 3 dice that are unlocked. So it sets the state. It also subtracts 1 from rolls left, because if we go to the game, where are you? We click again. We need to make sure that every time we roll, rolls left is going down, and you can't keep rolling unless you assign a score. And then that method, roll, is called down here by this button right here. OnClick equals this.roll. So it's not passed down to a child. It's just right in the parent component. It's not its own. We could have made it, a button component or something, but this is simple enough. And that's pretty much all that there is to this as far as the overall structure. Now, there are a lot of details about how the scoring works, about exactly what is being set in the state at any given point. So I still recommend, for your own sake, if you're confused, which would be very understandable, that you go through this line by line, step through it. What happens when I click on this? What happens when I click this button? What is updated in the state? What did it look like before? What does it look like after? What happens when I click on a rule row? What did it look like before in the state? What happened after? All of that stuff, it will really help you with the rest of the exercise. Next up, we're going to fix that bug that's been bothering us where we can't actually freeze any dice.